So tonight I want to talk about the literature review part of your thesis. So how do you take this thing called the lit base that you've been putting together with your 15 articles and turn it into something coherent? So let's start by defining what a literature review is and why it's important. I think you probably know the answer to this, but let's get everyone on the same page. So a literature review is essentially a comprehensive summary of all existing research relevant to a specific question or topic. So think of it as a foundation upon which new research is built. So when we conduct a literature review, we're not just summarizing other studies, we're analyzing and synthesizing them to understand what's already known about our topic. So the purpose here is threefold. First, it helps us understand the current state of research in our field. What do we know and what don't we know? Second, it demonstrates the importance and relevance of our own research, showing that there's a good reason for us to pursue our specific question. And finally, it shows us that we've done our homework, thoroughly investigating the background of our topic before diving into new research. In a thesis, the literature review has a few critical components. First, it justifies your research. By situating your work within existing knowledge, you're able to show how your research contributes something unique or valuable. So, for example, if you're studying strategies for English language learners, your literature review might reveal what's already been tried and where gaps still exist. Second, a good literature review helps identify gaps in the literature. These gaps are important because they reveal where previous research might be lacking or outdated, and that's where your study can make a difference. For instance, in counseling, there may be limited research on how family therapy works with adolescents from different cultural backgrounds. Next, the literature review builds context. It links your research question to a larger academic conversation, showing how ideas have developed over time. And lastly, it demonstrates expertise. You're proving that you know your field well and are ready to add to the conversation meaningfully. There are different types of literature reviews, and each has its own approach. A narrative review is broad and general, providing a summary of a wide range of studies without strict criteria for selection. This is often used to give an overall picture without getting too detailed. A systemic review, on the other hand, is much more structured. It follows strict criteria for which studies to include, which reduces bias. So, for instance, a systemic review of coping mechanisms among counselors in crisis situations might only include studies that meet specific methodological standards. Then we have theoretical reviews, which focus on specific theories or models related to the topic. So these reviews might compare different theories, like various social emotional learning models, to see which one offers the best framework. And finally, there's meta-analysis. This involves pooling statistical data from multiple studies to draw broader conclusions. So, for example, in class management, a meta-analysis could help determine the overall effectiveness of different behavioral interventions. Each type of review serves a different purpose, and depending on the research question, you'll select accordingly. Conducting a literature review involves a few key steps. And first, of course, define your research question. So this step is crucial because it gives you a clear focus. Rather than trying to cover everything, you narrow down to a specific aspect. For example, if you're in education, you might focus on something like, how effective are peer mentoring programs for first-year high school students? Once you have your question, you start searching for literature, right? We've all done this. Reliable sources are essential, so you're using the various databases like Google Scholar or ERIC, or APA PsycInfo. all of these things we went over with the research librarian. So after you gather your sources, you need to evaluate and select the most relevant and credible studies, ideally focusing on peer-reviewed articles. And then once you have your sources, you organize the literature in a way that makes sense. So by theme, by date, or methodology, and we've all done this. Finally, write the review itself. Now, this is what we're up to. So this step goes beyond just summarizing. It involves synthesizing the findings. You're looking for patterns, contradictions, gaps. This synthesis helps provide a clear picture of the current state of research and how your study will fit into it. There are several ways to organize a literature review, depending on your topic and what makes the most sense for presenting the research logically. One way is by theme. This approach is helpful when there are different angles to explore. So, for example, if you're studying inclusive classroom strategies, you might have themes like teacher attitudes, student outcomes, and policy implications. Another approach is organizing chronologically. So this method is useful if you want to show how research has evolved over time. So for example, if you're reviewing teletherapy's effectiveness, a chronological approach could show how acceptance has grown, especially after COVID. By methodology is another option, which allows you to compare the effectiveness of different research methods. For instance, if your topic is student resilience, you could compare findings from qualitative interviews, quantitative surveys, and mixed method studies. Lastly, organizing by theoretical framework can work well if your thesis relies on a specific theory. So for example, if you're studying self-efficacy in education, you might compare Bandura's theory of self-efficacy with other psychological theories. Writing a literature review involves more than just summarizing studies, as I've said. So first you need to summarize key studies and their findings. So for instance, Jones 2020 found that teacher empathy increased student engagement. Then compare and contrast the studies. This helps you show where studies agree or diverge. So for example, while Smith 2019 found that peer mentoring increased engagement, Lee 2021 saw no impact on grades. Synthesizing information is key to creating a cohesive narrative. So for example, after comparing studies on peer mentoring, you might conclude these studies suggest that peer mentoring has social benefits but limited academic impact. Lastly, critique limitations in the studies. Point out biases, small sample sizes, or a lack of diversity. For example, most peer mentoring studies focus on urban schools, leaving rural settings underexplored. So this critique shows that you're aware of the limitations in existing research and can identify areas for improvement. So let's go over some do's and don'ts. Do use reliable sources and make sure they're peer reviewed. Connect your review to your research question and remember to discuss both the strengths and weaknesses of the studies. This makes your review balanced and thorough. Here's a don't. Avoid simply listing studies without analyzing them. You want to show patterns and insights, not just summaries. Don't include studies that don't relate directly to your research question, and avoid relying on outdated sources unless they're crucial to understanding the history of your field. So conducting a literature review can be challenging, but there are ways to make it easier. Start with broad keywords, then refine your search with specific terms if you haven't already done this. Use a mix of general databases and specialized ones for your field. Tools like EndNote, and there's others out there, can help you organize and annotate your references so you don't lose track of sources. Look for reoccurring themes and patterns across studies, and as you review each study, ask yourself, how does this inform my research? Now, if you did your lit phase correctly, you've already been doing this. So this helps you connect studies and see the bigger picture. So in conclusion, at least for this portion, a literature review is foundational for any thesis, and it allows you to identify gaps and justify why your research is necessary. Remember, a literature review is not static. It should evolve as new studies come out or as your own research progresses. And so treat it as a living document that supports and guides your research journey. So how your literature review looks for this final paper for this class might be very different than how it looks for your final thesis. Now I want to go into some specifics around a specific example. I think I just said the word specific quite a few times.
Okay, I switched over to my headset, so hopefully this is a little louder. So I want to go over this kind of made up example here, um, just to show you how this all comes together. So in this example, which is looking at peer mentoring programs for high school students, um, there's a section that summarizes the benefits of peer mentoring programs, particularly for first year high school students. And the author is pointing out that peer mentoring can positively influence social connectedness and reduce dropout rates. So, some key findings here, if we look at this, Smith and Johnson in 2018 observed positive social outcomes, indicating that students felt more connected and supported. Lee in 2019 highlighted increases in resilience and confidence, but noted minimal impact on grades. So, in this case, the author links findings across studies to show a trend. Peer mentoring benefits students socially, but may not enhance academic performance. And so, this synthesis helps underline where peer mentoring has the most impact. The author critiques the over reliance on self reported surveys, which can introduce bias as students might want to appear more engaged. Okay, I ended that previous slide a little abruptly. I had more to say, but anyway, here we are. Okay, so in the second example, which is family therapy for adolescents with anxiety, in this literature review, we see that it's examining family therapy's effectiveness for treating adolescent anxiety, showing both positive outcomes and limitations. So, Brown and Lee 2020 reported a significant reduction in anxiety symptoms among adolescents in family therapy. White 2021 found that involving family in therapy fosters better communication and coping within the family. Harris et al. In 2019 observed no improvement in cases where family members had untreated mental health issues. So the author weaves these findings together, suggesting that family therapy can be beneficial, but its success may depend on family members' engagement and mental health status. So in the critique, the research largely reflects Western family dynamics lacking cultural specificity. So, for instance, non Western families with different decision making structures are underrepresented, highlighting a gap. The studies often don't account for socioeconomic status, which can affect access and engagement in therapy. And so this critique points out a bias that could skew results and affect the generalizability of the findings. All right, let's keep going. Example three, teacher attitudes towards inclusive classrooms. So this section focuses on how teachers' attitudes um, are towards how their attitudes towards inclusion influence their effectiveness in inclusive classrooms. So Green 2021 noted that positive attitudes among teachers led to more supportive practices for students with disabilities. And Lee and Nagayan found that teachers lacking special education training felt less prepared, often resorting to disciplinary methods rather than supportive interventions. So the author combines these findings to show that teacher attitudes shaped by training directly influence inclusive classroom success. And this synthesis illustrates how attitude and training intersect to affect outcomes. And in the critique, the author points out that class size and resource availability are often overlooked, but likely impact how supportive teachers can be, regardless of their attitudes. And also that there was some geographical bias, that most of the studies in the review are from North America, suggesting a need for research in diverse contexts to explore how culture might influence teachers' perspectives on inclusion.